Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. My guest today is Dr. Aaron French, who was a guest on the podcast last year when we talked about the Mandela effect. This time, we're talking about a lot of things, but the core topic regards the links between the esoteric thought of Rudolf Steiner and how this is connected to the contemporary UFO field and phenomena. Dr. Aaron French teaches in the International Religious Studies Master Program at the University of Erfurt, Germany. He earned his doctoral degree in the study of religion, including an emphasis in science and technology studies from the University of California, Davis. His dissertation focused on the history of esotericism, secularization, and disenchantment in modern Europe by making a comparison of the German intellectuals Max Weber and Rudolf Steiner. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in academic journals and regularly gives lectures and presentations at international workshops. He collaborates on research projects and publications dealing with the topic of the occult in history, spiritualism, alternative religious movements, modern architecture, and sacred space. My conversation with Aaron is, to quote him, a time of exploration. And this is really us going down many different little rabbit holes to examine all of the information that Aaron, and myself too, have found with regard to the area of high strangeness. In this first part, Aaron is expanding on earlier presentations that he gave this year on this topic. He is looking at the relationship between technology and enchantment, or technology and magic, and is asking the question, how does technology reenchant the world? One area that we can find a lot of interesting material is the so-called UFO field. We are looking at the weirdness that is found here, and weird is not meant as a derogatory term. We're not trying to validate it at this stage, but in doing so, in looking at this, we find that we have to wade through a lot of stuff just to try to answer these questions. And our laughter during this discussion is the recognition that you can't just talk about something simply and succinctly with this topic. It's not out of an intent to ridicule, but it's just the recognition that, wow, this is some really complex stuff. So we begin with Aaron talking about his research findings regarding the links between Steiner and J. Allen Hynek, who was a scientist working with the U.S. government in its project to study the so-called UFO phenomena. And then we go from there, looking at the esoteric ideas, how they have developed and have become assimilated into New Age thought, and how that is included in a lot of narratives and ideas around the UFO field. So I'll leave it there as far as the introduction is concerned, and I hope you enjoy part one. Welcome back to the podcast, Aaron.
Hello, thank you for inviting me back.
I am so happy to be able to talk with you again. This time we're going to be talking about something a little different. That's putting it mildly. We're going to be talking about esotericism / occult ideas, and in this case, relating to the teachings of Rudolf Steiner and the UFO connection to those ideas. You recently gave a presentation at the Trans States Conference this past September, which I also attended and really enjoyed. But as is most often the case, conference panels must run on a strict time limit, so you weren't able to discuss everything that you could have, all of the information that you have gathered in your research. So for this discussion, for this conversation, I thought, maybe this would be a good idea just to, let's just talk about all of this. For the listeners out there, this is going to be a pretty free-form type of conversation, not highly structured. We have some topics that we've already kind of put down on paper that we'd like to address, but a lot of it will probably also just be a lot of going down little rabbit holes, and we'll just see how far we get with all of that. So I hope this will be cohesive and coherent enough for the listeners out there. Aaron.
Yes.
Please, let's start with your case study, your research findings. A lot of this stuff will probably be new for me because I haven't heard this yet. I haven't heard you talk about it yet. So let's start there. You just take the floor and talk about it, and then we'll just move on from there. Okay?
Okay. Yeah, that sounds perfect. And this will be a time of exploration.
Exactly.
Is what we're doing. And I'm happy to also expand on this. So I appreciate this opportunity to come on and talk again. As you mentioned, I did give this talk at the Trans States Conference recently. And then it was new and experimental. That conference, is an art and history, art and esotericism type of conference. So it's already interested in sort of blurring the line a little bit between practitioner and scholar and so forth, which I like a lot, also being an artist and writer myself and so forth. So I tried to take that opportunity to go in a more experimental direction with my research. And the results was, at least were very, I'm still following up on them, and I think there is something really there to talk about. But because it was sort of new, I had so much material that I wasn't really able to fit it into the time slot very well. And but luckily I was able to give a follow-up talk that was a full hour, presentation, an online lecture that Dr. Jenny Butler invited me to give this talk at Cork, part of their lecture series. So that should be online soon. And I felt better about that, sort of redeemed in a certain sense that I could in that one kind of flesh out the whole thing better. Mm-hmm. And we had a great discussion after that as well. But even so, it's still like the very beginnings of an idea.
Right.
But I thought I could at least, maybe I'll just do a quick run through of what the talk was about. Yeah, and it will open the doors to all of this other funniness that's going to come in on the heels of just what I'm going to say here. So the way I wanted to structure the talk was, the conference itself was about technology and it was based on the second tarot card. Mm-hmm. The number 1, if the Fool is 0 and so forth. So the Magician card. Yeah. Is that the third? Not the second, right?
Yes, because actually you have the High Priestess is 2. So yeah.
She's 2, right? 1, yeah. But then comes Magician. That's right. And so the notion was about sort of, the magician works with matter. It was about like techne and esotericism, but also revealing and trickster elements and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so I'm interested in how technology, especially recently, technology and enchantment are related. And because I specialize in esotericism, enchantment for me is this world of esotericism, especially in modern context to a certain extent. So, and that's the world of magic, So then technology and magic become a very interesting question to me. And I did write one article that's coming out soon about how science was used as a form of enchantment, reenchantment in the modern context in Germany. Mm. Yeah, and so, but technology and science, are they the same? Are they different? In science and technology studies, there's this concept technoscience where there's no separation now between science and technology. And I think I agree with that notion, actually. And so I wanted to think about how does specifically technology reenchant the world? And what's the better example of this than the UFO phenomenon? Right. Technological things apparently floating around in the sky that are changing people's lives with lights shooting off them. So this was why I kind of started this question. And I did my dissertation on Rudolf Steiner, who's a German-Austrian esotericist at the beginning of the 20th century. Right at the beginning of this whole lead up to New Age, there was no UFOs then. It was not long after, it's World War II is when this UFO thing starts. So it was not long after he passed away. He died in 1925. And many of his students and many of the other students of his cohort of esotericists who were all alive at the same time, some of them lived on, they picked up this UFO thing more and sort of ran with it. And it followed from there. And the New Age movement is a good example of that. So he doesn't ever mention this specifically. Of course, the idea of the airships were a huge thing in the theosophical community at the end of the 19th century. That what is this flying technology, that special knowledge that we have to be able to fly and airships. And so that was there, but he doesn't really, at least that I found, Steiner doesn't talk about airships so much. He was much more interested in spiritual beings of various orders and so forth. But that does come in, obviously, with the UFO phenomenon. So, but the way I structured this, it's a lot of, again, I'm already like, this is way too much information. Where am I going to go with this? But we'll just go, and you can tell me to shut up at any time, okay?
Okay.
The way I tried to start it was with the current trend which is like ongoing and in process and quite mysterious in and of itself with the UFO/UAP question right now. And a brief background is like there was an article written in the New York Times. It's quite well known now that I think it was in 2017, I believe. And it was written by Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kean and one other person whose name I don't recall at the moment. But this article, because it was in the New York Times, was taken, with a high degree of respectability. And it talked about an apparently secret program within the Pentagon called ATIP that was had been studying UFOs and had actually had valid, reports and sightings from military personnel or Navy personnel. And then this article talked about this, released some names of people who were involved with the project, and also released some videos that they said were unexplained military videos that was like an example of the kind of things they were seeing. Yeah, and so because this thing was was published in the New York Times, it created a lot of traction, a lot of interest, a lot of like ability for people who maybe wouldn't touch the subject before to start writing about it. So one thing I said at the beginning of my presentation, I want to say it here, is I'm not interested in sort of validating or discrediting any of these ideas about theories, about people involved in this. I'm more interested in, because I like weird things, I'm more interested in looking at the weirdness, and exploring it. But, one of the things that happened with this was there was this thing called To the Stars Academy, which was founded not long after or in relation to this article. It's not exactly clear. And this was, there were many people involved. I think most people will sort of know what I'm talking about, so I don't have to go through it all. But they had former and current government employees as part of this. There was authors like Peter Levenda, and also the guitarist of Blink-182, Tom DeLonge, was part of this. So there was a sort of art, entertainment, UFO science conglomerate thing here, and government apparently. And they were interested in what they said was very interesting, is that this is where I got to the technology thing, is they were actually interested in exotic materials, what they called metamaterials, materials that are somehow not of natural construction. We don't know where they came from. Maybe they came from in relation to purported UFO crashes or events or something. Mm-hmm. And then they wanted to test these materials. And the point of testing them for analysis was connected to a certain extent with aerospace design, how to use these to create more technologies. And of course, I'm indebted to the work of Diana Pasalka, who's another religious studies scholar who wrote a whole book, American Cosmic, in relation to this kind of question about technology and the UFO phenomenon. And according to her, if you read her book, there is this connection going on already between people involved, not necessarily academics, but it could be, not even necessarily scientists, but although it could be, but in the world of sort of engineering, and development and production of technology and design, there is people who have interest in this UFO thing, sometimes feel they have some kind of connection to this phenomenon, and it inspires their designs and so forth. But then you have this other element of apparent materials showing up that are also being tested, and somehow these are being fitted into the development of technology as well. So like one of the first slides I showed in my talk was about Area 51. Mm-hmm. just because there's a sort of a placeholder in the past is related to this that I come back to at the end. So to finish this part of it, there was this program, this ATIP program went on for a while. It went on, not the program, but went on being discussed within these circles and being written about. And some of the people who were apparently part of it were now spokespeople on TV about the UFO. And this thing, they tried to switch the name to UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, as a more respectable way, I suppose, of speaking about it and losing some of the stigma. But another thing I showed in my slide was that there's a bit of controversy around all this in the last year, in that this ATIP program turns out, and I won't go into the backgrounds of this, people can look it up just to give you the summary here. It turns out that it was actually a nickname for a larger program called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, or OSAP, which was actually a larger study to look at all forms of the paranormal, set up by Senator Harry Reid and James Lukatsky at a place called Skinwalker Ranch. Primarily, the activities apparently went on here, which was a site of UFO and paranormal wackiness that was purchased by Bob Bigelow of Bigelow Aerospace, who's a known UFO enthusiast. And so that was sort of the next piece in this thing. And since then, some people have had a reaction to this revelation that there was actually part of this other program, which wasn't just about UFOs. It was about all of this other stuff. And in fact, not only was it all about this other stuff, it was not written into the program in a very clear way. And the program seemed to be more about development of weapons technologies and so forth, So I showed a picture from one well-known YouTube channel in connection with the New York Post called The Basement Office Show. And the guy who runs this show, the journalist, he recently released a show after this called The UFO Lie, Shocking Truth, a Pentagon OSAP Program. There's another individual, John Greenwald, sort of independent reporter for the Black Vault, who is also sort of questioning this whole thing. So that's just two examples. There are others. Of course, not everyone is questioning it. Some people are just, oh, yeah, makes sense. It's actually better that we're studying this whole range of phenomena, and it's not just about UFOs. But I just point that out to say that's kind of where it is now. There is a bit of a shakiness to the whole thing and a bit of a debate going on about what exactly is being studied, what's going on here, what is the background. And some people are skeptical. Nevertheless, my point was that none of that necessarily matters, because you now have active UFO or UAP programs being discussed in Congress and being set up as by the Pentagon. And so in a major official way, the UFO UAP question is now mainstream in the White House, in Congress, being part of the discussion, all framed within the sense of, does this pose a national security threat, which, of course, going back to Project Blue Book and Hynek, which we'll talk about, already had this framework around it. But so my point is that Congress, the Department of Defense, and the Pentagon are now taking UFOs seriously. And some of them are even suggesting that whatever these things are, they are not man-made. They might not be man-made. And my entry point from this into Steiner was one way this is being interpreted. And I gave the example of Wisconsin Representative Micah Gallagher, who was recently on a show and suggested that UFOs could be us in the future, coming back to us using these advanced forms of technology. So when I heard that, I thought made me think of something that Steiner had said. And it isn't just this representative. There is also a PhD professor of anthropology named Michael P. Masters, who is at Montana Technological University. Apparently, he also had a connection to MIT. And he's an anthropologist, but he's also writing about the UFO phenomenon from this sort of evolutionary biology, anthropology perspective, also with the technology. And his thesis, and two books he released one this year and one, I think, 2-3 years ago. His thesis is that the UFO phenomenon is us, in quotes, in the future, using technology, in quotes, so advanced that it's, it's able to get around the space time problem and travel backward, the speed of light thing, and then travel backwards in the stream of time to the present, something like that. And that's what the experience is. So that's just part one. I don't know if I should keep going or.
This is just dipping the toe right in the top of the water.
Right. I still have to get to the other two people I was actually talking about in the.
Please continue.
But if you can see a little bit here, like why this technology, you think about technology and enchantment, that's my overall, as a scholar of religion, that's what I'm interested in. It's just I have to wade through all of this stuff to think about that, Yeah. But that is there, really, technology, time machines from the future, bringing back, plasma body beings to us now. I mean, it's a different reality than, is a sort of the consensus reality or something like that. So that's what I mean by enchantment, and the technology is another vehicle for this. Yeah. So the connection that I wanted to make, though, not only with Steiner and this evolutionary aspect, but was with J. Allen Hynek. And so what I had learned was that Hynek was interested in Rudolf Steiner. And so this gave me more pause and made me want to understand how that connection worked. And because Steiner is, very prominent esotericist, very influential. Hynek, very influential in the UFO history of ufology, but also very influential and very, revolutionary scientist and astronomer also. So I wanted to see how does this fit together. So the second part of my talk was about J. Allen Hynek. And he was, of course, a professional astronomer, and he worked at various very reputable observatories. He was also at Northwestern University for a while working. During the war, he helped to develop the top secret proximity fuse, which is a way of testing rockets. And I wanted to just mention this book where I'm getting a lot of this information about Hynek. It just came out recently. It's called The Close Encounters Man: How One Man Made the World Believe in UFOs by Mark O'Connell. So this is like the kind of first full-length biography on Hynek, which goes into some of these Steiner connections, actually. But you also find a lot of biography information in Jacques Vallée's published diaries about this. So that was another area I was looking. So, Hynek, he in his science work, in his astronomy work, he was, very much connected to and instrumental in classifying stars and that sort of thing. But he also had worked during the war on this weapons tracking systems. He was also part of tracking man-made objects in Earth, not just rockets or missiles, but also satellites. So he was there during the whole Sputnik thing. But this is also the UFO moment, this Cold War thing. So that's like his scientific career in a nutshell. But then he also got involved in the UFO thing, and he worked for Project Sign, which later became Project Blue Book. Most people, I think, know what Project Blue Book is, and now there was like a show about it apparently recently also, I think. And this was like an attempt to, again, like as these UFO sightings were showing up, the government wanted to find out, what are they? Is there some kind of threat, really? Are they actually are they just something from a foreign adversary? Are they something from Mars, or something? Or are they, what are they? So people sort of know, I think, the story about that, so I don't have to go into it too much. Just to say that he was, the idea is like he was part of, why it's a little bit controversial is he was part of classifying UFO reports, sort of in part debunking them. I mean, the book goes into a little bit about how he felt pressured also at some points to just get rid of this by his people who had been giving him these tasks in the higher ups in the Pentagon or the Department of Defense or wherever. And he did do that, and he did debunk things, but you could see him looking at it like a scientist too, especially if you're interested in how light interacts with human perception and so forth, which he was already, and weather, in terms of weather also. But he also, you could tell, did take it seriously, and eventually, it's another long story. Eventually, he kind of breaks with this whole, the government tries to kind of shut down the program, basically, and he's part of this, actually, of shutting down the whole question. But then he kind of steps away from that, and this, according to him, this allows him to really study it he wants to study this UFO phenomenon as a scientist in a scientific way. And so it's almost like you get this blue book debunking, but also not. I mean, he did make attempts to try to legitimate certain reports. This then gets this is like one chapter, and then when this thing gets supposedly shut down, he then moves on, starts his own research center, and now he wants to study the UFO phenomenon with in a scientific way and doing his own thing without this oversight or something. Mm-hmm. And part of this, he meets someone who was a grad student at the time named Dr. Jacques Vallée, who is now quite a well-known author in the UFO field, but also a well-known scientist. And now I'd like to just get quickly to the connection between Hynek and Rosicrucianism, or more specifically Rudolf Steiner. So in an interview, there are a couple of interviews that came out in which Vallée says that he was interested in Rosicrucianism when he was younger, and that so was Hynek. This is just a quote from one of these interviews that Vallée says. The interviewer asks him, I was surprised to learn later that Dr. Hynek was also a member of the Rosicrucians for a number of years. And Jacques Vallée says, yes, I think I relate in my diary the time when we came to discussing this, and I was delighted to learn that he had for many years gotten information from the tradition as well. We both came to the conclusion, by the way, that we really didn't need an organization to continue this research, as there were many sources around and the kind of research was best done independently. But those organizations were very sincere and gave us a start. So both Jacques Vallée and his friend and mentor J. Hynek had an affinity for and training in Rosicrucianism. And this simultaneous interest, in my opinion, what I wanted to argue, in both science and esotericism, in fact, helped the UFO phenomenon to be better understood and taken from a more serious scientific perspective. So there's more to that. You can find, that's just one example. I mean, when my talk's up online, so people can go watch it. Like, I show more examples of clearly Hynek was deeply interested in Steiner all the way to the end of his life, and in Rosicrucianism. And just as an example, when he was going to pass away in the 80s, he had his wife read to him Rudolf Steiner book as he was sick, and his health was failing. And I think that's kind of like shows you how important the teachings of Rudolf Steiner were for him, in a kind of almost like religious sense, you know what I mean? Or at least in a sense of giving meaning to, what's after this when I read from here. So that's Hynek. So we have two parts here. I'm almost done, I promise. This part, at least. The first part is us from the future using technology to come see ourselves now. Then there's the Hynek interested in esotericism, Hynek being very influential in developing ufology as a field in the 20th century. So then I went to Steiner. And this is I got a little bit into this when I ran out of time. That was like all I got through was to about here. Yes. Didn't even get to the actual part.
Right.
But I did mention it a little bit, and I'll just mention it briefly here. That so if you look in Steiner's work, he's talking about many well-known esoteric concepts and tropes. He has his own spin and his own contribution also. But there was one article that had come across where it's the language is the most similar to something like the UFO or extraterrestrials or something. And I showed the evolutionary schema in Steiner's system, which he called anthroposophy. I showed on the slide that the Earth itself is developing through different incarnations, just like a human is, and the human is taking on new forms in each one of these incarnations, even biologically and physically. And the planet is also doing this. It's sort of evolving out of material, like the matter is becoming more refined, finite, until it's just stardust or something. And and the final stage of this he calls planet Vulcan. So the first one is Saturn. You have a couple others, then you have Earth, where we are now. Then you have a couple more, and then the final one, it's like 7 or 8 steps, I can't remember. He calls Vulcan. And he says that the state of consciousness into which human race kind of enters in this phase, he calls godliness, or the highest kind of spiritual consciousness. But in this one particular article that I found of his, that I was reading this lecture, which is part of a larger lecture series, actually, he talks about how God, this is again another rabbit hole that I have to dig up on. I'm sorry here. See how I can do this quickly. In 1879, Steiner says, angels fell from the heavens. They are now sort of evil, fallen angels down here on Earth, interacting with people and driving them nuts. So that's happening since 1879. So I'm putting it in my own words here, obviously. But in response to that, he says, other beings from outside of the cosmos, he says, and this is in this one particular lecture, who he says are not human. And this was a point of confusion for me, which I followed up on in preparation for this. These beings are not human. They're coming from outside of our cosmos, and they're coming to Earth in response to these other beings that were thrown out of heaven, basically, and down here terrorizing us all. And these beings want to help us. And how do they help us? According to him, they bring us spiritual science, which is, of course, his esoteric philosophy. You know, right. But of course, the idea of spiritual science doesn't have to be just his philosophy. You can kind of get the idea, spiritual and science. Okay, somehow bridging the gap between these two realms of knowledge. So in his words, these spirits are bringing, these beings, non-human beings, are bringing this here, coming up, showing up more and more. And he says they're going to continue to show up more and more in the future. And that humanity's response to them is to ignore them completely, to reject that they even exist, and to not turn in their direction. So he kind of ends the essay saying, then he says that who these beings are the Vulcan, us, evolved to this Vulcan state, hundreds of thousands of years from now, something like that, coming back to meet us now, to assist us, something like this. And then that's what's a little bit tricky because, we can come back to this, like, are they human or not? He says they're not human, they're from out of the cosmos, but they're apparently us. We are human, and we are in the cosmos. Who are these? You know, how is it the same thing? But at any rate, he says that they're coming back to help us, and we are ignoring them. So he says, like, the way to get out of this problem, he says, is we have to turn our attention to this cosmos, like, look up, basically, because that's where he doesn't say this, our space brothers are coming, our space us, coming to help us through this difficult time of darkness and evil. I mean, there's more to it. I then sort of wrapped it up to just show more about Rosicrucianism as a form of esotericism involved in bridging the science and religion problem, and to try to show how Hynek was also interested in this. He was interested in Rosicrucianism through Steiner. They both seem to be working on similar problems of bridging the divide between something like science and religion, and technology is key also for both of them. And so, you know, this technology thing, the ability of technology to also inform all of these ideas, this reenchantment, was what my point was. And you might have questions, so I can, if it's not clear, you can just ask me, but just so I can end this thing. The way I then ended it was to go back to Area 51, all right, to show that when they were developing the stealth bomber, apparently the whole like hide and reveal game was going on of like, do we have these new kinds of technology? Do we not? If they were testing them out there, and they looked very strange, you know, this was back in the 80s or the early 90s, I think, then they would be sort of, you know, oh, that's weather, or that's, or it was even, maybe it was just, it could have been a UFO, but we don't know, and so that's it. So there was this sort of like obfuscation part of it as well. And it was only like in the last maybe 10 years, if not, something like 10 years, in which the existence of this Area 51 base was even acknowledged, like officially, you know. And so I shift from that to the current debate about UFOs, like people interpreting it, scholars even, who are interested in this, as it's us using some kind of technology to come back to ourselves now. And then the question of what are the UFOs that we're seeing? They're technology, but they're not technology like my toaster, you know, or something. They're like something that produces this whole other worldview and this whole other state of awe. And it's like, is it just technology, or is it, you know, beings beyond our own ability to imagine in some kind of thing that we can't even imagine here outside of time? You know, it's like, or is it just a drone that we don't understand, or that the Russians developed, or something like that. And it's kept in this liminal space too. It's like no one can answer any of that. How are you going to answer that? So you're just in this liminal space of trickiness, of reenchantment, and so on. So I think I'm going to stop after that, just to see where we want to go.
All right, so let's reflect. You're talking about this relationship between technology and magic is what we're talking about here, but it's interesting that there is this material side of technology that governmental agencies are interested in. And there's of course, the stories that there is some type of advanced technology that we're trying to reverse engineer and understand so that we can make more technology from that, as you said. But then there's this other aspect of technology that is more magic, I would say. It's the techniques, it's this knowledge, it's this way of evolving to a higher state, whether that be physical or conscious based. That's still kind of unclear, I guess, or uncertain. But gosh, yeah. All these things that you're talking about and many other things, it's like triggering all these little things that, okay, yeah, I've read this person, I've read that person, they're talking about this, they're talking about that. And it kind of all seems to fit, like little puzzle pieces are starting to kind of fit together in my mind. It's still very unclear, but I think we're getting somewhere, at least in my head. Another thing that I find interesting about this is, you were talking about the stigma that this topic holds, and yet at the same time you have, accredited and respected scientists, anthropologists, other types of astronomers, that are interested in this, and they're taking this seriously. And this gets put in with, I mean, when you mention Skinwalker Ranch, even if that was an official program with real scientists, now it has become this almost like I don't even know the word for it. I mean, it's, when anybody says Skinwalker Ranch, it's almost as if it's turned into like a horror trope or something like that. So I think what you're getting at here is this tension between the perceptions of what's happening within this area. There are some people who are trying to say, okay, this is valid and worth studying, and other people are saying this is just a bunch of bunk. This is this is made up. This is just a farce. So then we get into, okay, I'm just thinking out loud here. We get into back to the esoteric teaching. I think this whole idea about us from the future, the benevolent beings, whatever they are, they come to try to help us. These ideas aren't specific to Rosicrucianism or Steiner. We've also had this in Theosophy as well. So these ideas aren't brand new, I guess. We've like Alice Bailey in the Theosophical Society was, also influencing the New Age a lot. And I find this link to the New Age movement also very, very relevant.
Well, and of course, if I could just pick up on that
Please.
Real quick, that there is, like the New Age movement, we could say maybe peaked in the 80s. I mean, I don't know, or at least changed through the 90s until now. I could be wrong, but
in what way? In what way are you saying that?
Well, that
you're talking about like channeling and things like that, channeling alien messages, things like that?
Yeah, and of course it's still around, and maybe it's even having another resurgence now with the internet. But if I look from the 1960s when it started to really get going until about the 80s, there I sort of see some of the major trends in this thing developing, and then after that you just kind of have rehashing. If I think about the X-Files, that's the end. of it all. Like as soon as you're like having that kind of farcical attitude and entertainment thing, it sort of shows where the kind of sentiment is. It could be argued that now it's sort of having a resurgence or something. But so like with someone like Hynek, it's caught up right in that generation. Steiner is before him, but Hynek is after. And Hynek was interested in not only Rosicrucianism. He, one of the things I didn't mention is he bought Manly P. Hall's famous, gigantic, esoteric tome, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, when he was like a teenager or something, and he spent his money on it, and his friends thought he was so weird. So he was interested in these esoteric ideas in connection with the limits of science. In one of the journal entries in Jacques Vallée's published journals now, this is what Hynek says, why he's into this stuff. He wants to see, he was interested in it because these people tried to go beyond the apparent limits of science. But he also, in the 80s, after he sort of had really established himself as a ufologist, and this was his main activity, although he still kept up his scientific work as well, he did endorse he did investigate and even endorse one in particular, whose name I don't have with me. It's in my notes, but individuals who claim to have contact with the entities, who were like sort of giving information, which is essentially channeling. Of course, he wouldn't have just get his stamp of approval on anyone, but he did investigate that as part of the UFO phenomenon, especially in the 80s. And like in the 80s, another reason why I think about this peak thing, I mean, maybe it's right in like 1990s. I don't know. I'd have to look of when this book, Bringers of the Dawn, Teachings from the Palladians, was published. But like that arc for me, that's sort of like that's sort of like the peak for me. I don't have a good explanation why, but it's that's my feeling, my sense of it. Okay. In which is sort of the 90s are quite different. 90s are what's going on. Something starts to change a bit as the 90s develop, and then 9/11 and so forth. And then, 2012, some people point as 2012 is the end of the new age because nothing happened supposedly, although something might have happened. But I see it already going on the downturn in the 80s. But Hynek was also involved in these kinds of questions, which were, really, part of they were derided. But that's also why I think that they were a lot in the air too, because of people could deride them. That you could get these channeling messages from aliens and so forth. So he had all of these interests. The point that I was interested in, though, is like that's a thin connection. Like, okay, they're both interested in Rosicrucianism. They were both interested in this idea of a technology, and I haven't quite pulled that out yet. I mean, I could tell we could go into what Steiner thought about technology. Hynek, I only know a little bit, but he did posit from early on this idea that there was a technology that was, he called it like material and mental or something, but he basically means like part spirit, part physical. And Steiner has the same notions that there's definitely a connection between technology and the development of it and human consciousness, human spirit, human subtle bodies, we could call them, whatever you want to name those. So there's a kind of a connection there. Then there's the idea of benevolent space beings. That they both shared some version of that. But I was really interested in, though, and this I need to dig in more into Hynek's work to find out, if he also entertained the idea that whatever this phenomenon was us in the future, sort of having developed, returning to us now using this advanced technology. And in Hynek and Vallée wrote a book together. I think it was in this book, or it was just in one of Vallée's books, where he talks about this idea of reverse reincarnation. And this is the idea. This is the same idea, basically. So Vallée was obviously interested in it. And those two were so close that I think, maybe Hynek would have been interested in this idea as well. And why do I care? Is because this is you find this trope now, currently, in connection with it being one of the explanatory frameworks for the phenomenon, which is linked, it hinges on technology. If we don't have technology, we can't come back and see ourselves. Only through this technology can we do this, So that, of course, is very interesting to me.
If I'm understanding correctly, this why Hynek and Vallée and even Steiner were interested in this is because this was information that was given to us, explaining to us how we can evolve to higher states of our potential, I guess you could say, correct?
And again, I'm not an expert on, I can't speak for Valet, or I'm not an expert on Hynek, but something like that is what I think they're both interested in. They're both interested in moving two things: moving science beyond its limitations. Right. But behind that is also the notion of, like becoming smarter, becoming more developed, becoming more spiritual, more advanced. I mean, getting around the problem of the limits of science is returning to a spiritual worldview. What is blocking the spiritual worldview currently? So you can't prove it scientifically.
Yes.
So you can get beyond those limits. You can begin to return to, and of course they don't want to go back to like middle-aged, Christianity or something. They want what Steiner wanted too, actually, which is this new Rosicrucian spiritual scientific view,
right?
Which you find people exploring this in the 60s a lot too.
This is a good point, and this is also interesting because this kind of ties back into this whole business of how occultism wanted to kind of be the link between science and religion. They wanted to be that third part in the to make a triad of occultism is how we can unite science and religion with the occult mindset and worldview. So this is, I don't know if this is accurate to say, but it seems as if it might be like a variation on this with the introduction of the technology in this part. So we're not just using ritual magic. We're not using the more spiritual side of the story, but we're also incorporating material matter into this whole argument with the idea that there are technologies that people can use to enhance and increase and maybe even quicken the evolution of the species to this higher state, to this more perfect state, which kind of really ties into the whole even theosophical society idea of this evolution of mankind, that we're supposed to reach these higher states, and the and how this all ties together with the Mahatmas coming to help us, these ascended masters.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
The ascended masters were also people. They were also human beings that were ascended.
Right.
They weren't aliens in this case with the Theosophical Society, but with this argument that this is us from the future. And the non-human aspect of it is a little bit tricky, but maybe it's because we're evolving to this perfect state, which makes us not human anymore or something.
Right. Yeah. Right? And I did. This exactly. And this is something I was trying to also to think about exactly what you said, and just in relation to Steiner, he makes these two claims. He explains that we're evolved into this future purely spiritual state, which is also what Theosophists were talking about. It's also what the transhumanists talk about. I made an article about that recently that came out, making connections, but argue in there that they're purely materialistic, whereas Theosophists and Steiner are doing it from the spiritual standpoint.
Correct.
So he says he calls these future beings Vulcans traveling back, like Spock, I think that's what he has in mind, actually. Spock is traveling back to meet us now, to help us, thankfully. But then he says, though, that these beings, though, are outside of the cosmos, non-humans. And I looked at the German, and it really is nicht mentions, not specifically not human. And this whole notion that these so-called fall of the spirits of darkness, this is actually the first, he says that when you read Steiner, he's like, occultists have always talked about this, and it's difficult to find what occultists, but some people have tracked down that Elvis Levy does actually talk about this year, 1879, as this event happening. So it's at least one place where Steiner is learning about it from. So they're coming in response to this 1879 year. So, but the Vulcans are coming, they're both us and not only us, in that there are sort of other beings involved here. So these ascended masters, at least in Steiner's case, these ascended masters you talked about, for Steiner, there's not just us here. There's a whole economy, whole ecosystem of spiritual beings out there at various stages of evolution,
Right.
even and elementals doing all sorts of things involved in the process. So and they're weaving in and out of us all the time also. So this sort of idea that anyone is just them is sort of not true for Steiner from the perspective of the spiritual realm. Like, people are always sort of, their boundaries are blurry, and fuzzy, and they interpenetrate. And so are not just people, but in the sort of from spiritual realm we're talking about, you're not physical, but also these other beings that he talks about. So when he says that the Vulcans are coming from the future to the past, it is us, but it's us with all of these other beings, in a certain sense, involved in this return process. So you kind of can't, if you try to use the concepts of space and time in the sense that we're used to, you can't really get a proper idea, in my opinion. I don't think to try to understand what is he talking about here. I mean, I think what he's talking about is our spirits commingle with these other spirits and each other as we develop. And so in this future point, this Vulcan period, yes, it's like us from today, but it's this whole sort of morphological process has happened, and it's this thing returning to us. And so I went back to see. He's clearly not talking about two different beings. The beings coming that he says are coming to help us are these us in the future, this Vulcan, but they're not human and they're not from this cosmos. So I think why he would say it like that is because he has this, and the Theosophist would also speak this way, this much larger sort of picture of development of everything is evolving. I wanted to go back to one thing that you mentioned here, of why I think science is the reenchanter extraordinaire, is because why do we have all these ideas? Why are they able to even come up with this? Is because of the idea of evolution. These 19th century occultists and theosophists, they did want to bring together, and it starts with the Rosicrucians, at least in Europe, somehow bring together science and religion. But the main hot scientific concept in the 19th century was evolution. So many religious groups which had problems with this, well, even until today, and want to reject this concept, even that whatever evidence we have to support it and so forth. But the Theosophists tried to accept it. They rejected Darwinian evolution, though. They said, yes, evolution is real and important, but not Darwin's. His is misleading, or his is materialistic or something. But it is true. And so now everything has to be evolving as soon as you accept this into something. Either it's just random, based on conditions, natural conditions, or with these theosophists and everyone, there is a whole groups of other beings involved in this process, evolving with us. The matter is evolving. Yeah. So it's fascinating to me that as soon as you introduce that concept of evolution, then you get to the transhumanists, you get to all of these ideas we're talking about here, which can't even really have legs at all if you don't have this evolutionary concept.
That's a good point. I think what we're talking about, really connects well to the New Age ideas that are linked, kind of embedded in the UFO phenomena, about the benevolent aliens bringing us messages. You sent me a link to a website this morning that I didn't have enough time to look at all of the different links on the website, but does give me real New Age vibes. It's called universe-people.com. And then on the page itself, it says heavenly-angels.org. I'd like you to talk about this in just a bit. The one thing
I mostly just sent you that. Just it was like sending you a morning coffee, or something. Oh. So like as soon as you see it, you go, you're awake. All he needs is the initial impression, and then the colors. The beautiful colors and images.
Yeah, very rainbow-like colors. There's even a rainbow on the page. Talks with teachings from my cosmic friends. This really ties into this one person that I'm familiar with called Barbara Lamb. She's a therapist doing hypnotic regression work. That's a controversial subject in and of itself. But let's just take this seriously and let's just go with it. She works with people who claim to be abducted by extraterrestrial beings, although she doesn't like to say abductions. She likes to say experiencers instead of abducted people. She likes to call it experiencers. But she also regresses people through this hypnosis to kind of remember what happened to them during these experiences. And she also claims that she works with people that call themselves hybrid human beings. So this kind of links in with this notion of the not entirely human, non-human, or this kind of morphing into something other than human with these hybrids. At this point in the story and the way that it is explained, hybrids are half human and half something else, something non-human. But that is just at the stage where people are at right now. So I guess the stage in the evolution where people are at. But anyway, this lady, Barbara Lamb, is very, very active in the UFO community. She also investigates crop circles and things like that. So she's, really into all of that. You find her all over YouTube. But the whole idea of this benevolence, the idea of benevolence and the idea of helping people to try to reach, a higher state of consciousness or a higher evolutionary state. She, in a presentation that she gave, this is, I guess, maybe 8 or 9 years ago by now, she was at this big UFO conference, and she was talking about how the people that she's worked with, that the experiencers, as she calls it, that their narratives include messages from these extraterrestrials or the ETs, that they want to help humans. But another thing that I found interesting, and have you heard anything about this in your research, is that some of these ETs, according to the narratives that she shared, had helped to engineer the human race and realized that, and they regret also that they created various flaws in the human species, such as aggression and greed and need for power, warmongering, and all the feelings of superiority, domination, et cetera, and that these ETs are now coming back to tweak us, to try to help us to get over all of these flaws and to try to make us into better people. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's it's really funny as I listen to you talk, because I see more clearly, like, it's framed in different language, but it's like the same thing that you're reading in Steiner and Theosophy. Just it's like a new spin on it, but it's really is part of the same. It's really interesting, and of course I had thought about that, but as I hear you talking, I'm thinking about Steiner. He basically says all of that too, just in a totally different kind of context and time. So this hypnotic regression thing is not being used. Of course, people are having experiences. Like Steiner went around, had lots of followers, and went around and talked to them. And you can find in some of his letters and people who wrote to him of people having spiritual experiences of light, and some of them might even sound of fire in the sky and so forth. Mm-hmm. Writing to him to have him, what does this mean? and also meeting, in the theosophical context, it's like, who are meeting the masters? Who's meeting these people? People are having experiences, and, the way one can validate that or not. So the one piece that's missing is this hypnotic regression thing. And if I think about why was that not there then, and it's there now, and I think we go through the lens of Jung, through this whole sort of shift in the psychotherapy. And of course, Steiner wrote very critically of both Jung and Freud, and he didn't like this at all, neither did his followers. So that's sort of interesting to me to think about. They said that they were taking something living and spiritual, unbewusst. The Unbewusstsein in German is like this realm, this unknown realm, unconscious realm. For Steiner and the Anthroposophists, I don't know about the Theosophists, this is a realm, this is the spiritual realm. It's of living beings. And when you abstract it into this notion of this unknown awareness realm, somehow related to the psyche, which has those symbols living there and so on, for them, this was his critique, that you're then you're materializing, killing something alive, living beings, turning them into something dead. So they did not, even though you would think like Jung and Steiner, hey, they're probably buddies, right? But no. And this is the reason why. Yeah. And so I think that could have something to do with, because, you go through that, you then start to come to these hypnosis methods a little bit, or at least it's somehow related, because a lot of these experiences, if I think about John Mack and others, are happening in this therapy setting,
Right.
But so that's just my initial thought, but but the other part that's definitely the same, if we remove this therapy part, is the hybrid thing, both the beings coming, negative and good, involved in evolution of us. And then also this hybridity notion. And so like somewhere, Steiner has gave so many lectures. Steiner's whole, I'm talking about him mostly because that's who I study. So I have Steiner glasses on because I'm trying to write papers about him and everything, but he's written so much and gave so many lectures that it's, and they're all, in a certain sense, there's difficulties with all the resources too, because of the history and because of, he mostly gave lectures and it was taken with a stenographer, which had to then be interpreted, or he gathered people's notes, and then his wife was the first to start editing them into actual books. And so there's nuances in all of that, but somewhere in all of that, he definitely says that there are other beings walking around in human bodies. And he said that it's not uncommon to meet someone who has another being is in their body when you're meeting them. And of course, he also talked a lot about past life, this whole past life regression. Of course, now it has this therapy component. Yeah. How are the Theosophists and Steiner people doing past life regression? Well, they're doing meditation, mostly, I imagine. They have other techniques as well, but this was also, of course, a massive element. And they all were Alexander the Great and all of these, they would find out their individualities. Not always someone like Alexander the Great, but sometime, one thing that's funny is the Hypatia, there's this fight between who was Hypatia. Was it Rudolf Steiner's wife or was it Annie Besant? They both claimed that they were Hypatia in a past life. They weren't like a milkmaid or something, but of course that's there also. So this remembering past lives in a therapy setting. So you already have this this kind of fluid notion of individuality, something like that. Yeah. And that's where you get this hypnosis element. So of course the hypnosis thing to me, I'm not I don't poo-poo it, but I wouldn't just jump on that without uncritically either, I guess is the way I would put it, just because you could see how it could be misused, even though I do think it could probably also produce results. In sleep is where you can probably get some of your best messages about yourself. I do agree with that.
If I can interject here just for a moment, just to clarify, the reason that it is considered controversial in this particular case with working with people who are trying to remember things that had happened to them, it's the memory retrieval aspect of hypnosis that is contested. It's not so much hypnosis in and of itself as being a bad thing, because there are arguments to be made for, like, if you want to stop smoking, or if you have a phobia, that you can use hypnotic techniques to try to help you, help you with those types of issues. But specifically in this case, with alien abductions, or experiencers, however you want to frame it, it's memory retrieval, because people within this field of, the scientific field of how memory works and all of this, they're saying that memory is not like a little file cabinet where you can take out the little individual files and say, okay, this is what happened on this day at this time, and I can just go into my data bank and retrieve that. There are people who say that you can do that, and there are people who say you can't do that. So that's why what I mean by the highly contested part of it, just to clarify that. So I agree with you that it can also, be used for other purposes.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point to think about. That we talked about the Mandela effect on this show once, and that's also related to that. It was memory so in that sense, what they're saying is these people are not remembering something that's stuck in there. Because that whole notion is that memories are constructed in the present, at least to some capacity. Right. So they are building something in those moments that they're remembering. Of course, that doesn't mean they're not building it off some structure that's in there, So it's pretty tricky.
It is, I admit. It's a very, it is tricky. It's kind of dubious because you don't really fully understand it. Mm-hmm. You don't understand how it works.
Right.
So, but I don't know if there was something else that you wanted to add on to that.
Well, I think I was trying to go back to the hybrid thing and just add a little bit that element of it is definitely part of it. Just it doesn't necessarily revolve around this memory retrieval, although it does, like with past life regression, if you think about it. But in this sense, now that I'm thinking about it, Steiner talks a lot in certain places about when you have a spiritual experience, he says you can't remember it because it's too big.
Yeah.
So every time you have a spiritual experience, he says, you have it as though it were the first time you ever had it, because you can't remember the last. You might have had one, but you can't remember it. This would include meeting angels or something like this.
Yeah.
So you would think in the moment, having the whole range of responses you would have to some being showing up, this experience, and you would think it was the first time this has ever happened to you, although it might have happened to you 5-10 times before. And then immediately when it's over, you forget. That's what he says. So it does have this really interesting memory part of it, which I hadn't actually thought about. But, the hybrid notion, I know what I wanted to say. The hybrid notion is there. As I said, beings are sort of weaving in and out, and we're weaving in and out of each other. Everything's much more fluid in this esoteric discourse and worldview. And then in Steiner's case, which is also, part of this, and I think Bailey and the Theosophists also have their own version of this, that these fallen spirits, they, like Steiner's big baddie is Ahriman, and Ahriman is not Lucifer. He has this two different. He's a sort of dualist. I call it moderate dualism that he uses, and this Ahriman, which is like the equivalent of Satan, and Lucifer is a different being with redemptive qualities. Ahriman is all about what you said: aggression, death, technology, fighting, nuclear bombs, materialism, science, physicalism in science. And so in his system, there's like a kind of how do we put it? Like a breakaway trajectory of evolution in which this being Ahriman leads people down that road into like the false unspiritual evolution in which they become, well, we don't need to go into what they become, but they become like the opposite of what you become in the other trajectory, which is spiritual beings of light. All these the kind of tropes you would see in New Age about like these evolved, enlightened, light-filled, sort of a streaming light out of them. I mean, Steiner says that everyone will become a sun eventually. So, and then they go out into the cosmos, and that's like what suns are or something. So you have that. And they're both even in this thing I said at the beginning, they're both interfering, or at least, trying to get their way down here with us. So you have these so-called Ahrimanic spirits from 1879 trying to push human beings towards rejection of spiritual concepts, towards materialism, over-reliance on technology. I've written about in some of my papers where I've talked about this in Steiner and Technology and other papers. And then you have these other beings, which are apparently us, I guess, in the future, also coming back, trying to help us. This is like the notion of the higher self, something like that. It's like our higher self. We want to just use simple New Age concepts. Our higher self is coming back to assist us. So again, I just wanted to say that because if you take that whole thing and put it on the UFO thing, you get some resonances,
Exactly. The esoteric speak is taken away from it, but basically what you're talking about is the same thing. And I have to add that Barbara Lamb also says she works with people who have had experiences with other types of ETs who are not these evolved, benevolent types. And she terms them reptilians or other, those, I think that's the only one I can really remember that she says that these are like lower forms, not so highly developed. They don't feel love. They don't know how to feel love. So there are people that are also encountering these other types of ETs as well, as she talks about it. But and I think that if I remember correctly, there are certain cases where people are coming to her for the therapies that she offers because they've had traumatic experiences with these lower forms of ETs. So, and I don't know what she does then with whatever type of therapy she uses. I'm not aware of that. Of course, I'm not in on these sessions, so I don't know exactly what it is that she's doing to try to help them overcome these traumas that they have. But she likes to put more of the focus on the good aliens and not so much on the bad aliens. Although there is the flip side of the whole narrative with the hypnosis being used on people who have claimed to have had experiences, and this has all kind of gone, very, very badly. We won't mention any names here just to kind of protect ourselves because we're not quite certain what the state of things are with this particular case. But yeah, there is a researcher who had been accused of doing some, I guess, unethical things, I guess we could say, with a patient, using hypnosis, not qualified to use hypnosis. And yeah, the mental health of the patient didn't improve and actually became much worse. So I think that's, in my experience of the whole issue about hypnosis, whether or not you should even use it for memory retrieval in UFO quote unquote abduction experiences, whether or not it's even a valid thing that you could use. Is it useful? Is it harmful? Those types of questions arose after all of this came out. And if you know, you know. If you know who I'm talking about, you know who I'm talking about. But I'm not going to name any names here because, again, we need to try to protect ourselves. I don't know.
If I could maybe just pick up on that real quick.
Please do.
Because Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, I think, was also based on, when he was doing meditation, Gurdjieffian meditation, I know also. I think he was also, part of his journey was also with this hypnosis, or I'm not sure exactly, but I think that it is a interesting central part of the whole, at least very contemporary.
Yeah.
The contemporary nature of this whole kind of story we're exploring here, this whole esoteric or not evolutionary, worldview thing. It does make, when you first are thinking about Steiner being so critical of Freud and Jung, it's a bit confusing. But if you think about it in this context, maybe mean, these people are trying to keep it. Steiner's people, his followers around him at the time, wanted to keep it in a very more strictly kind of like social, but it's really like a more quote unquote Western mystery tradition style practice. Kind of keep it in there. They wanted to make it legitimate scientifically, but they were not like willing to abstract it necessarily, and so that was their critique of, in some book I read that where did the occultism, where did it go to die? In Freud's, into Freud, because that was sort of where this whole notion of the occult died, and when this notion of the unconscious was born, and especially in a Freudian context, which is a much more trying to garner scientific credibility. Of course, now they don't have. There's now that it's not really. It's problematic now, but at the time it was not. I mean, it was totally. It was. I mean, I think. Yeah, I have to look back in sort of the history of psychoanalysis, but its goal was to achieve this scientific credibility for sure, which is also respectable in a certain sense too. So it's just making me kind of reflect on that. But I thought what I could also just add to that is interesting is a story about my wife in relation to this whole story you were telling about aliens. My wife, Veronica, was born and raised in Las Vegas, so not far from Area 51, actually. And she had lots of friends, even some who worked there, and they had all these funny stories to tell. And one of the popular talking points about that there was a bit like what you said, that there were these that there had been a sort of a faulty line of evolution, or some other beings had disrupted our evolution or screwed their own evolution up, and they had like bred out or engineered out all of the positive qualities, but especially they had bred out emotional capacities, and so they were like completely complete intellect, and had lost the ability to have sensations and emotions, especially like heart-centered kind of things. And this is why they looked the way they looked in this story. Sort of not necessarily heads, more intellect, less body. Body shrunk and reduced, heads important because of intellect. And of course, eyes, seeing,
Yeah.
And so why were the people being abducted in Las Vegas in these circles? It was because they had realized the sort of error of their ways, or the problem with this, and wanted to breed emotion back into them, into their gene stock, I guess. I don't know what the right word for that. But so that's why they were abducting people and having babies with them. And so this is a whole other area we're not quite getting into about, pregnancies and missing pregnancies and so forth. But this was also something going on there. And the reason for it was this breeding back in this emotional qualities, which we still had here because we hadn't gotten rid of, engineered it out yet. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. But yeah, but one more thing related to this whole thing about she had a dream once about being abducted by aliens, and maybe she'd had a few of them, but in one of them, this is back then in Las Vegas, she then, in one of the dreams, she decided to get up and just start like kicking the shit out of all of them. And she did that, and she just basically kicked their asses out of the room, the bedroom, and then they never came back again. So it's interesting to me that this whole idea of working out trauma and therapy and this is the emotional, this is also a part of it, which of course UFO researchers have noticed this and are trying to, how do we weave all these things together? But I just wanted to add that story, as it's a little bit related to what you're talking about, this other trope of these beings who need to fix themselves somehow. In this case, it was about emotions,
Yeah. I hadn't heard it in that specific context, but that makes sense. Makes sense why the reptilians would want to have hybrid children with humans, because humans do have the capacity to feel emotion, and maybe that's what they're trying to do. Bring that back into their species. So, everything is possible here, of course, in this discussion. We're open-minded here, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, folks, we're not done yet. Join us for part 2, where we continue our discussion regarding the notion that UFOs and ETs are us from the future, and how this all connects to contemporary popular media, occulture, and even more high strangeness. If you're interested to know more about the works of Diana Pasulka, Michael P. Masters, the New York Times article that Aaron mentioned, or the Basement Office show that was also mentioned, check out the program notes for the links to all of those. And I would recommend watching the Basement Office video called The UFO Lie on YouTube. It is pretty wild, but it helps to give a lot more context. And don't forget, part 2 is coming up.